The good news portion tonight is district wrestling champs 17 years in a row. AJ, you want to come on up, please?
Say something. Yeah. So 17 in a row, and it was also our third regional title in a row. If you guys would stand up, you guys from the team, if you'd stand up. I'm just real proud of them as a group, as a whole. They're a resilient bunch. On paper, we're not as good as some, but with what we lack in talent, we make up for in teamwork and heart and belief. They're just great kids. They're everything that we want to embody here at Tecumseh. I believe. I appreciate their work ethic, their dedication, and their caring for each other. They're very selfless people. They put others before themselves, and I think that's why we're successful, to be honest. They're very selfless, and they think of their team first before the individual stuff. So I'm very proud of them. If you're a state qualifier, could you stand up? So we have 6 guys. We have 6 guys going to the stand up, so I'm going to introduce you. There's 6 guys going to state meet this weekend at Ford Field. Lucas Petty, 135. Joshua Hilton, 112. Victor Coscarelli, 130. Vincent Perez, 119. Clayton Boatwright, 189. And Kellen Patton, 125. Once again, I'm very proud of these young men, and I wish them the best of luck this weekend at Ford Field as they all pursue an individual state title. I appreciate you guys having us here. It means a lot. I'm very glad that we could be a right spot here tonight at the board meeting. So thanks.
Good luck, you guys, this weekend.
Mr. Perez, I have a question. How come you're the only one with, you don't have blonde hair?
I was going to ask that. He didn't want to do it.
Okay, we'll check with your mother later. Thank you.
All right, this brings us to our first public comment section. This is on agenda items only, and each speaker is limited to 3 minutes because agendas are full. So anybody have any comments on the agenda? Okay, and we're going to move on. Can I get approval of the agenda or any revisions?
Move to remove the scheduled reports from it for a conversation with the administrators. Any information in that will be handled in discussion items tonight.
Roll call. Benson?
Aye.
Brooks? Aye. Johnson?
Aye.
McNamara?
Aye.
Moore?
Aye.
Simpson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, then we're going to move on to the One Tecumseh Initiative. Mr. Rhodes?
Yes, sir. Well, maybe we can pull that down a little bit. A little bit possible. Above the camera. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So I'll stand here versus sitting at the podium. Hopefully my voice will hold out. So a couple things about where we're at right now with phase one. We did complete all the interviews with the Board of Education. So essentially, that's that part about synthesizing their platform of what were the key points that you ran on or that you were elected upon in terms of your platform. So that's done. All the documentation was received concerning the original strategic design. So the internal team has put that together and provided that to me. Actually, we finished the review over the weekend in terms of all the data that was provided and all the original information. So we completed that. The student performance, essentially we took 2 people from our math department in the high school, and those are the ones that are going through looking at MSTEP, ACT, SAT. They're also looking at NWEA scores, so we're using internal resources for that. I will check in with them most likely next week just to get an update as far as where they're at. This coming weekend, on Saturday, we actually have a survey design workshop. What that is that's the portion where we talked about wanting to survey the community, our teachers, and the indirect staff. That's being done by Jason Young. He is the Director of Institutional Research at Siena Heights University, so he'll be supporting us during that entire process. That way we can bring in some outside viewpoints and they'll help us in terms of integrity. So I know that teachers were very leery about providing survey results internally to us, so those surveys will actually be driven externally by this individual. Committee membership, so we had a small delay in this. The teachers union actually asked 2 other teachers to participate in that, so we have gone through the selection process. We will be finalizing those. We worked on that today. We'll work on that probably through Wednesday. Our goal is to get that out this week on the website publicly so that everybody can see that selection process or that those candidates that were selected. And then we'll notify those candidates in terms of what the next steps are and what we're going to be working on. But I did receive feedback from everybody that was on the committee for the selection itself. Once that's all done, then we'll push that to you so that you can see that information. And then we may have to have a short board meeting to talk about that to accept it before we go on. So remember, you still have to select, you still have to accept that. It's just a recommendation in terms from our side in terms of the committee itself. There's also another portion later on. Mr. Mills is going to talk about perhaps we have access to a grant that's several $100,000. So we may actually need to have another board meeting this week, but we'll talk about that later on. And if we can do that, then we can knock out both of those things at the same time. We also talked about visiting other educational institutions in the upcoming weeks as a reference point. So this is something what we'd like to do. We intend on going out and visiting some locations. So I've actually asked Mr. Mills to look at that and to find out other reference points for us to go see, to talk to as far as how their programs are being run and how those schools are being run. So that's the intention of phase one. Once again, the idea of phase one is take all of the data that we have from best practice, from evaluation of student performance, the surveys, as well as synthesizing the platform that the school board ran on, and using that as an input to the committees. So that's a key portion of data that they need when they sit down to first start having their discussions. Phase three, something I want to talk about because this question has come up about the committees. So first of all, a little bit of detail. So the committees are structured and they're going to be led by one member of the school board. There will be either myself or Griff on each one of the committees at a minimum. Topics are not random. So the committee, it's not just a free-for-all when you step into the committee. There are actually very specific topics that each committee will be tasked to deal with almost immediately. And that's part of the strategic redesign, and the input is basically phase one, all of that data. All the proposals from each committee are presented to the school board as a recommendation via the superintendent. So once again, it's not that the committees themselves are providing directly to the school board, it's as a recommendation that will still come through the superintendent. It's not meant as a filtration process, it's meant as a way to make sure that we understand what cause and effect are, so if we talk about one item, that we don't talk about that in isolation without impact to other areas. So for example, if we talk about impacts to curriculum, what does that have to do with, for example, the financial side? So there could be two components to that. So that's the reason why we want to make sure that those topics are not done in silos, that they go through the superintendents, either Griff or myself, and then we'll talk about that together. One thing I've had many questions, people have said, well, are these committee meetings going to be open to the public? Absolutely, they're going to be open to the public. So the intention is to have a forum very similar to this, to allow people in the public to make comments prior to the actual committee meeting taking place. We'll be publishing agendas for each one of those committees, and there'll also be a public comment section at the end. There were several people that wanted to be part of these committees, but unfortunately due to time or other constraints weren't able to participate or didn't even apply, but they'd still like to have their voice heard, so we want to make sure that their voices are heard through that public comment section. So we'll ensure that that occurs. So in essence, the committees, to be quite clear, it's structured, it's led by one of the board members. There will be either myself or Mr. Mills on each one of those committees, or maybe two of us, depending on for example, in the curriculum committee, probably both of us will participate. And probably most important is their proposals, their recommendations. Still the final decision rests with the school board. And that's, I think, a key point that people need to understand. It's still the decision rests with you. You're the governing body for our district. Any questions on that in terms of what we're doing?
And the committee meetings will be posted
Yes.
in
Yes.
advance on,
Yes. I mean, we can't do anything ad hoc, because people are volunteering their time, so we need to be as structured as possible
Right.
for those people so they can participate. We need to be sensitive of they have other schedules, they have other lives, but they still want to participate in these committees. We will also look at, what's the best time and location, so we're going to have to get a feeler for that from people as well. Some days, some people have to work on the weekends, some people are free during the work days, so we're going to have to do some type of a balance between evenings during the week and then perhaps a weekend on a Saturday, if possible. Yes, sir.
We're gonna plan on running these like a board meeting then, with a public comment section and an agenda and everything else, so.
Yes.
I just wanna make sure we don't turn it into a free-for-all, as far as like just people who are not part of the committee being a little too involved during the meetings. I want the committee to be focused on their tasks and, the public can comment, but I want it to be, limited like it would be in a typical board meeting.
My intention is that we will run it just like a board meeting. We'll have meeting minutes that'll have to be published, signed off by the committee themselves. There'll be action items, things like that, for sure.
It's a meeting held in public, not
It's a meeting held in public.
a public meeting.
It's not a public meeting, but it is a meeting held in public, for sure. Other questions? Anything from your side, Mr. Wells? Okay, that's it then in terms of the Tecumseh update.
Okay. And Griff's gonna go over the 2019-20 school of choice.
Good evening. I'm going to do the same thing, just stand right here. We'll let Ryan get that up there for us. Thank you. So I think one of the roles that Ryan and I, it's a responsibility for us, is to give you guys as much information and continue trying to educate you. Some of these things I'm sure you already understand and know. Some you might have some questions. Tonight, just talking a little bit about understanding schools of choice. That's the first thing I've always referred to it and always heard it referred to school of choice, but the technical term is schools of choice. Definition of that, really, what we're talking about are when non-resident students want to come to Tecumseh Public Schools and what that looks like, where we can get funding for kids, that type of thing. So that's what schools of choice is. With that, there's two sections of legislation. There's something called Section 105, and that allows kids within our ISD, our 11 schools in the county, to come to Tecumseh High School, and we get funding for them. That's what 105 is. Examples of that would be a student that might live in Clinton or Adrian or Madison, them wanting to come to our school. The second part of the legislation is Section 105C, and that allows students who lives in counties or different ISDs that touch up to ours. Examples of that could be Washtenaw, Monroe, where their kids can come to our school district as well. So the process that the board goes through is first you have to make sure you want to continue along the path that we've done. We want to be a schools of choice. I put a couple of numbers up there currently, and these aren't hard numbers, but for our spring count, we basically have 479 students of school of choice. And for the whole year, for that full FTE, you're looking at about $3,592,604. That's the funding that we get for that amount of students. Next thing we have to decide is, do we want to have unlimited spots or limited spots? And basically the difference is with unlimited, that means kids can come into our district, and there's just certain things that we can take a look at. And I'll talk about that in a second. Unlimited, or limited, means there's a certain number of kids that we allow into our district. Let's hypothetically say 100 kids. And then there would be a lottery to see if those kids would get into our district. Next thing is we have to decide, do we want to have section 105 and or do we want to have section 105C? Do we want to continue down the path? It's been several years, I can't look back and tell you how many, but I've only known us to do unlimited schools of choice for kids using both sections, 105 and 105C. And then there's a specific set of timelines, and that's kind of on the last slides, and I won't go through that. That's already in your board packet. But if we're unlimited, there's a description of what that looks like, and then there's a timeline of what we have to do. And the same thing if it's limited. There's a description of what that looks like, and there's a timeline for that. And then we have to determine, do students meet the enrollment requirements? So looking at that, we have to determine if a student met our enrollment requirements, and then we notify the parents that their child has been accepted to our school district. A school district may refuse a student being enrolled based on age, and that you look at to make sure that it's an appropriate placement for that student based on how old they are. Obviously, common sense tells us we cannot discriminate. Race, religion, disability, any of those things we cannot do. The one thing that we can do is we can look at a student's past 2 years of discipline, and if there's a suspension there, then we can make a decision not to allow that student to come into our district. And that's common with everybody that's schools of choice. That's part of the legislative process. The other thing is, once a student is accepted into so those 479 students that are school choice students, we can't come back next year and say, we don't want half of you, or we don't want those things. Those students are still subject to discipline. They can still be expelled if they have a discipline issue that warrants that. So these are a little bit of the timelines. I won't take the time to go through that. You guys can kind of look at that piece on your own, depending on what we decide. And then basically, Ryan and I, we recommend that we continue the past practice of being a schools of choice district that utilizes section 105 and section 105C. That's our recommendation to you guys. If there's some questions that you have in a second that I can answer, great. If there's some more information that you need that I can't answer tonight, I'll get you that information in the short term here. And then our next move with this, depending on what you decide, is we would have a resolution at our next board meeting, and you could vote on it. So that's kind of the process for schools of choice in our district. Questions? Let me add one more thing. Let me add one more piece, because I know Becky and I were talking a little bit. So the process we go through, when we screen students, so to speak, and we look at that discipline piece, I'll use the high school example. We will call that other principal at the other school, and we have a sheet of paper that we fill out, and we write down who we talked to, what date it was, the time it was, and what that person had to say about the student. And then that goes on top of the school of choice application. That is one piece that I wanted to make sure you guys knew. So there is a process in place. That form is not on our website, if you were looking for it at that time. So a little bit of more information. That took care of my first question.
Okay, I thought that.
Do we know where most of the kids come from? I mean, are they mostly from Adrian, or are they?
They're all over, to be honest with you. I can look at that and get back to you and give you.
Okay,
Great
I was
question.
just wondering how many were, come every year because of the way our district is so,
Unique.
chopped up.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yep.
So, the discipline part, that doesn't have to be a strict rule. We still have the ability to take those kids in even if they have been suspended.
Correct.
My thought behind that is if we put them in the virtual program, if they weren't necessarily a candidate for a seat in the classroom,
Yep.
we could put them in the virtual.
We are probably one of the few places, a lot of schools will send kids to us that are behind in credits and maybe have made a poor choice.
Mhm.
Those kids are put on seat time waiver and they get to do their schooling at home. And we can set it up depending on what that issue is, of them never ever coming into the building. But by state rules, we have to have some type of contact with them.
Sure.
We support them either over the phone or through email or a combination of a lot of those things.
Do any other local schools do that same thing?
In terms of like seat time waiver,
Yeah.
there's a few, but I'll be honest with you, most people aren't where we're at with
I mean,
it.
I've not even heard of that, seat
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Of the 479 students, what is the spread of them? Are they more in the high school? or-
Probably majority in the high school. There's probably about 120 or seat time waivers in the high school. Around that, what would you say, Ann? I don't mean to put you on the spot. In that ballpark, maybe? I know in the past, it's been about 90 to 100 kids.
The second, what do we get per child? Is there a
$7,400. There is and a little bit of change, but there is a difference. Madison, they get a higher balance. I think it was around 8,000 maybe? Somewhere around there.
8,400.
So every student we get from Madison, we wouldn't get our normal $7,400. We would get the same funding that they get from the state for students that reside in their district, which would be about 8,000. I think we have about 15 students from Madison district that go to school of choice there. That doesn't mean everybody needs to go out and recruit all Madison
Yeah, can we
students.
put a billboard by Walmart?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
In terms of capacity, I know everybody knows that we're down head count overall.
Yep.
Okay. In fact, this, you said 479?
Yes, sir.
Is that down from last year, or is that on an upward trend still, or?
I'd have to look.
So my real question is, in regards to capacity, hoping that we bring a lot more students in, do we have the capacity, staff-wise, teachers, to support them already? Or
We
is that?
can, well, we can, but we have to watch that number and that ratio, and then if we get to a certain point, then we need to add staff. Because most of our kids are having 15-minute meetings once a week, and to schedule all that and to make that happen, that's where they come in and you talk academics. How are you doing? What goals have you set? What progress have you made? You know, that type of thing. We also have kids that either email, text, or Facebook those instructors to get resets for quizzes that they're taking. So it's kind of a 24/7 where the people that work in that virtual academy, they're very accessible to kids.
Well, outside the scope of just virtual academy, school of choice coming in, how is our student-to-teacher ratio at this moment? I know it's not what it's going to be in the fall, but
Yeah.
are we set up that we can handle how many students before we have to increase staff? Do we have a number on that yet?
We can take a look at that and see, give you a pretty fair estimate. It's going to vary at each level.
By grade, right, of
Elementary's
course.
going to be a little bit
Right.
different, the middle school and then the high school. By teacher contract in the high school, it's generally 34 students per classroom, with some exceptions. That might be a PE class, that might be the band, that might be some different things like that. So there are a few exceptions to that contractually.
Do we get any special supplements or anything for special ed students?
That is something that we do get through the ISD. Yep. Great question.
Do you know how many kids live in the district?
You guys only get 5 questions today.
Sorry.
I
thought it was academic night. Do you know how many kids live in this district that actually don't go to Tecumseh Public Schools?
No, we used to. I don't know what it is this year, but that's something we can, if you write that down, and we'll take a look at that, get you guys that information. Good question.
I think there's a report.
There is, and I was just going to ask, we still are working on, I'm asking you, of course, we're still working on the data to send to the ISD to be audited. What's the timeline for getting that audited data back or confirmation of the numbers? What kind of timeline does this go through from now to the end of the year?
I can't give you a number as to how many kids have left Tecumseh under school of choice, because that audit is not done yet.
Right.
For fall count. Spring count, we have 6 weeks from count day to get a file up to the state and get it certified. And then after that, the auditor has, I think it's 3 months to do an audit on those numbers, 3 or 4 months.
So,
It's quite a window that they have to do the audit.
okay,
So
so
the fall-
realistically, we're not going to see those numbers until we're all on summer vacation, right?
Probably.
And part of that process also is the auditor will give some things like, hey, we need this, or, you know, let's check this. And so Anna goes through a long list of things that the auditor wants. So there's a time piece to that as well.
But we have last year's information, we could.
Yeah, we have last year's information you can look at. Definitely. And then as soon as she'll put out a graph, the auditor will put out a graph as to what kids left, what district, and where they went, and things like that.
Oh, that's good.
But that's not coming out until she gets done with all of her audits with all the districts. So it's, again, it's gonna be a little bit later before we can have that information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Griff. Okay, Mr. Rhodes for the 18-19 budget revision.
Okay, school budget. Revision 2. So, sorry about the screen. First I want to talk about our funding sources. So where's money coming from? You can see in the pie chart, we basically collect money from property taxes, state aid allowances, operating grants, and local funds or private sources, or charges for services. Some points I want to cover before we start talking about the budget. Student enrollment is actually one of the largest variables that we have. So as that variable changes, our funding changes and follows that as well. The balance remaining after expenses are considered, so you look at funding sources and you look at expenses, and then you're really talking about fund equity at that point in time. And I'm going to mention that later because we're going to look at that. Fund equity health is calculated as reserves against expenditures, and that's total expenditures. It's not actually against revenue. A breach of 10% or below, you're put on a watch list by the state of Michigan. So that's something key. School financial accounting is very different than corporate accounting. And what I mean by that is that school accounting is not as detailed orientated as financial accounting that occurs inside of corporations or companies or things like that. That's sometimes an issue that we have in terms of trying to track down where costs are flowing, but I mean, we do a fairly good job with the data that we have. We create a school budget on an estimated number of students. That's something that is very key for the school board to understand. We don't know, when we create our budget and we're sitting here in June and you authorize that budget, we really don't know how many students for a fact that we're going to have, they're going to start in the fall. So everything is an estimate. So when you have estimates, what a lot of people do is they put in cushion or buffer places in order to account for those unknown variables. And that can also create problems as well. When I stepped in and I started looking at the process, what happened was that budgets were always calculated based on historical figures. So they'd always look to the past, they'd make some minor changes, and then that would be the budget for the next year. Also, too, it was very top-down in terms of administration. It was not done per se as a bottom-up, meaning that we went out to all the administrators, all the principals, and we created a bottom-up budget, and then we rolled that up and then did a top-down and then looked at a comparison between the two. It was very much in the hands of one or two people for quite a period of time. There would be some questions that would go out, but in the end it was a top-down based budget. That means those people that were responsible for living with the budget, whatever came out, at the end they had to find a way to live with, whether that was reasonable or not. And that's basically how the budgets are done inside of TPS. That creates its own problems or challenges. So as I talked about, basically student enrollment is very important. So I'm showing you the last 10 years of FTE. FTE is full-time equivalent. It's a key figure that determines the funding. It is not the same thing as headcount. Headcount and FTE are different. You can have percentage. You might have a kid that's taking, a partial class, and so we count that from a partial standpoint. That's the reason why they're not full numbers. But if you look at 2008, and you look at where we're standing right now in 2018, what you generally see is a downward trend for the last 10 years inside of TPS. These numbers are generated from the LISD. The number for 2018 is essentially unaudited. That is a number which we provided in the fall, but we're still waiting for it to be finalized. But those are the numbers. That is what the LISD looks at. That's what we have to report on. So that's not a good picture in itself, because if you can see, we've been on a continuous slide. We had a bump in 2016, a slight rise in 2015 and 2016, but 2016 to 17, and then from 17 to 18, we have a decrease. This budget, revision 1. So the original budget put together last year, and then you look at the revision 1, which was accepted November 12, 2018 by the previous board. A few things happened. So we had the total revenues, which are at the top. I'll point this out up here. Total revenues at the top. And then what happened is that they went in and they made some high-level cuts to offset those reductions in funding. And those high-level cuts were not planned in detail. They were just placeholders at the very top. So let's cut 200,000 here, let's cut 100,000 here, let's cut 15,000 here, let's cut 170,000 here. It was not done in any depth or detail. It was not done with people understanding how they had to implement those cuts that were put in place. It was just simply a high-level number that was reduced. Now the impact of that, and why I say that for me, which was a budget that was approved by the board, you have an instance where expenses for utilities was already going to exceed what was already budgeted. So, I mean, that's just an unrealistic number. The numbers that we put for EduStaff, which are basically our external people where they're located, where we have people at, it's like a third-party employment service, we made massive cuts in those areas, but if you looked at what the projected budget was going to be through the remainder of the year, we were going to, of course, exceed those planned cuts. There was no way that that was even reasonable or feasible. It just wasn't going to happen. It was also based on some assumptions that we were going to close positions. Everything from the director of student services to teachers not being replaced, which actually ended up being replaced, cutting custodians. We applied decreases to budget positions, as I already said, where expenditures had already exceeded the planned cuts. So this was basically a budget thrown up in November to say, okay, we're going to offset the losses in students, but it didn't realistically reflect the situation that we had. Reduction was not verified with all impacted departments in terms of feasibility. That's a fact. I checked in the various areas where people had to deal with these budget cuts. People said, okay, we'll figure it out, we'll find out whatever we have to do. But it had actually not been approved by the various areas in administration prior to being approved by the school board. Right there, following the number, difficult to see, but essentially we would have been, you can see expense down here at the bottom of the revenue. Excess revenue, we would have actually dipped into the fund by $68,275 into our fund equity. But that was based on the fact that would all of these cuts have been realistic? No, they were not all realistic. So with that being said, that's actually not a true picture of where we would have ended up this year had we followed that plan. Real picture is something like this. Fact is, if we look at the total expenditures, we're actually going to have to dip into our total fund equity quite significantly. It's difficult to see down here because of the way it's done. I'm sorry about that. Let's see if we can, is there any way to pull this down further? Move this out. Thank you, sir. There. Makes it easier to read. Actually, we're going to be dipping into the excess revenue by close to $1.5 million. It's still going to leave us with a 14% fund equity, but the key points in terms of these expenses that I'm talking about that weren't properly planned or properly cut, we corrected the EduStaff. That's $304,000. That was done incorrectly. We increased facilities expenditures because we had already utilized most of the grounds maintenance. We had to plan for HVAC, PM services and repairs, custodial supplies, painting supplies. For example, the utility expenses, where what was budgeted was actually lower than the actuals from the previous year. That's what I mentioned earlier. We have additional instructional assistants that we've talked about because we've been running really thin in terms of our instructional assistants. When one is out, people are in a panic to try to cover them. Most times the principal has to go down and try to cover for them. Corrected activity positions, teachers that actually been replaced but were actually planned as a budget cut. Our SRO officer, don't panic Chad, but we weren't properly planned for in terms of the budget. You are now, so it's okay. Director of Student Services, same thing. We corrected a budgeting mistake for last year. There was a new phone system put in. It was a $30,000 expenditure, but it was left off the budget completely. Technology in terms of some of the cameras, making them compliant, bringing them up to date, that's $51,000, and raises for indirect FTEs were about $65,000. Now, concerning the raises, what I'm talking about here is we are struggling to find substitute teachers, custodians, instructional assistants, because we've done a benchmark in the county, and we're fairly low in terms of what we pay people, so it's difficult to find people. These are not all of the corrections. There's actually quite a few more that I put up. These are just some of the highlights and summaries that I put up on the screen for you. And in essence, what happens, fund equity is a very interesting thing. If I starve my investments and I don't invest in things, I can make my fund equity look really good. But if I have to continuously invest, then my fund equity might not look like what it is, but then we don't have these massive investments that we have to take every few years. And that's essentially what's happening. I think that from my standpoint in terms of the budget, this is realistically where we're going to end up at the end of this year. I mean, it's not pretty. We have to dive pretty deep into our fund equity. We're still left with a healthy balance of over 14%, so that's fine. But this picture right here is not sustainable. We cannot continue like this in terms of running the district. We have to look at making continuous investments, whether that's in facilities, whether it's our buildings, whether it's technology, whether it's school books, whether it's looking at our staff in terms of are we paying competitive wages in terms of the industry, but we have to consider that. Some key messages that I have for you. We have to start controlling spending. So the situation comes up today, I get expense reports that all come across my desk. I ask, are these things in budget? Most people can't even answer that because they don't know. They haven't been part of the budgeting process before. So if someone wants to go to a conference, was that properly planned for in terms of the school budget? Nobody really knows. I look at the conference, by the time it's hit my desk, it's already too late. There's nothing I can do. Budgeting process needs to be adapted. Right now it's top down. A few people at the top make the budget, goes in front of the, well, the way it used to be, go in front of the board, they'd approve it and go on from there. Process that we've introduced in our last finance workshop that we have is we're going to introduce a bottom-up budget as well. So we're going to start asking administrators by next year, they're going to have to take accountability for their budgets as well. It's not like they're not trying. It's not like they didn't fail, and I want to make that absolutely clear to everybody. They just haven't been given the information and the ability to do that before. You know, before that was always kind of centrally controlled. Grant reporting. So we have grants, and I have lots of questions of how much money have I spent in my grant? How much money is available? So we have to work on grant reporting. We need to be much more transparent in terms of that. We had a case where I found out that someone didn't apply for a grant in time, though they were supposed to. They knew the due date. They didn't apply for the grant, but we had already spent the money. So it's $5,000 that we're automatically taking towards a hit towards basically our equity fund because we didn't plan the grant properly. So had we had the right reporting and the right mechanisms in place, we wouldn't have allowed the spending without having the grant being in place already. And that's something that we have to correct internally. Requisitioners and approvers. So in our purchasing process, you know, when people want to go do something or they want to purchase something, we need to make sure that that's actually been budgeted for. So as I said, once again, I get requests that come across my desk, and my first question back is, did we budget for this? Do we even know if it's been approved? Was this something that was contained, discussed? And so right now I'm pushing back to people saying, okay, is this actually in the budget or not? But I mean, Griff can answer that question. He can tell you they didn't really participate in that budgeting process in previous years. They had a certain limit of participation, but that was it. Controlling task force, cost controlling. So we need to look in this. We need to look at and understand where is cash flowing out in terms of TPS. Where is it going to? And I'm talking about suppliers. I'm talking about money internally that's going out. Who's spending money on what and where's it going? We have a lot of this information today, but it's really about controlling that and about making sure that the money is going in a proper way. I'm not saying that anything illegal is happening, that is not the case, but it's very difficult to do cost control when someone says, well, I was told I could do this, and so I put it in and I purchased it, and by the time we got through the process, we realized, okay, really have no idea if it was a budget or not. So we're gonna be much more strict in terms of this. And I already talked about this, starving investments that are required. It doesn't matter if it's facilities, technologies, competitive wages, to maintain a high fund equity. I mean, sure, I can do that. I can starve investments, I can make our fund equity look great, we can have a wonderful percentage, but then we're gonna reach some point in time where we need to work on our buildings, where we need to replace certain technology, we need to buy textbooks, we need to get raises, those types of things. So we need to be very careful about that in terms of how we look at that balance. I mean, we will never get to a zero fund equity because that's not the goal. We need to have something in fund equity. The question is, how much do we need in fund equity and how much is healthy? Right now we're lucky and we're fortunate. But I can tell you, if you go back to this picture right here, and we look at all the corrections that need to be made for this year, based on a budget that was approved in November of last year, that's not a pretty picture. These are not wants. Many of these things are needs that our people have at this point in time. If I don't give raises, if we don't find a way to do raises, I'm not going to get instructional assistants. Right now, people apply, and it's maybe one here, maybe two there. Joanna, I think she might be in here. She can verify that. She'll tell you that. We are struggling to find instructional assistants. Same thing with custodians. We can't find custodians at this point in time. We have to pay competitive wages. That's it. I wish it was a prettier picture. It's not. The key message is this is not sustainable. We cannot do this next year. This right here, though, that's got to change. If we don't find a way to bring students back, and if we don't find a way to increase enrollment in TPS, we will have a serious issue. So that falls back to the things that we're doing inside of TPS, inside of these various committees, the things that we're looking at doing in terms of our strategic redesign. If we don't bring students back, we have a problem. Yes, I understood before, and I've had that discussion, that previously the thought was, okay, we can take a hit, we can lose a few students, but eventually people will come back. But that's not the case. We don't have 2 or 3 years to wait for people to come back, for a system to function. In the fall of this coming year, it needs to function, and we need to be bringing students back as quickly as possible. We don't have time to go 2 or 3 years. It's not possible. Not with expenditures like this. That's not possible. I don't have better news, but at least it is what it is. Questions?
So, when I look at this budget, the budget that was introduced in November, am I looking at this correctly, saying that there was $170,000 taken out of our maintenance budget?
Yes.
And this
It was
is,
done at a high level.
but we also had a report at that same time of all the HVAC units potentially needing service and replacement in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, we knew that there was work that needed to be done.
So, based on the work that needs to be done, how much more do we need to actually add to that budget instead of taking away from it?
Well, that's why I say when we come here and we look at it, I mean, what we're adding here in terms of operations and maintenance,
So you added,
I already added it back in. That's already there. And I sat down with Tim. He's here in the room right now. We sat down multiple times and we talked about the difference between a need and a want. And I feel pretty comfortable that he's looking at needs, not wants at this point in time.
how much longer can we do this based on our current enrollment? And we dip under the 10%?
No,
Fund
no,
equity. Are we
don't
gonna
have
hit
time.
10% in the fall of next
Yeah,
year?
no, there is no way we can have that student ratio right there and maintain these type of expenditures and be okay. We'll dip under 10%. It's just not possible.
What's our fund equity at? Do you have that on there? What's our
Yeah,
fund equity?
fund equity balance will be 4.1 million and some change.
Yeah. That's what I said in June.
Well, it's a fact. I mean, we need to correct it. Question, sir?
Speaking towards your increased maintenance cost, I was to the admin building and I inquired about history of repair orders and history of maintenance and repair of assets, and there's nothing in the folders. Do we have, this is only for Tim, do we have any PM plans being set up currently for all of our assets, whether they be electronic hardware, software, vehicles, buildings, do we have a set PM schedule for all that stuff already?
Some of that stuff is worked in the budget, some of it was denied. The HVAC equipment, the PM schedules were not feasible, so it's not currently.
My understanding is the equipment itself isn't really worth changing the oil on when it's about to fall apart, right? That's what we're talking about. So-
Essentially, yes, yeah, but, yeah, the HVAC equipment is in very dire needs, I guess, for improvement.
That's a need of
replacement.
replacement, not a PM
Yes.
schedule.
Yes.
But everything else, we're getting a PM schedule on, if it doesn't already have one,
For
so
the
we can
most
get more
part, yes.
mileage.
Yeah, and a lot of that's, I mean, not a must, and you can't avoid it. I mean, you gotta, do some of that preventative maintenance on certain things. And the HVAC equipment is a big part of that, of course. I mean, that's our biggest expense as far as, machinery, equipment goes. But there's quite a bit of that could, essentially be replaced at this point. I know a proposal was presented to the previous board of over $5 million for the next 5 years for HVAC equipment alone.
5 million per year?
No, over 5 years.
Over 5, okay.
Correct. For replacement of equipment. That can be addressed and looked at, a little tighter as far as that goes and see what's an absolute must and what we can get by with. But between roofs and HVAC equipment, in the next 5 years, it could be over $7 million.
And the point is, we don't have the fund equity for that.
Absolutely.
As long as the student enrollment keeps and looks like this, that plan right there, that's not feasible.
But we do need to get those PM plans in place, so we can get every mile we can out of what we do have.
Yeah, I should back up. We looked at an outside company performing a lot of the PM services on the HVAC equipment, and that was basically turned down. The cost of it was deemed too much, I guess.
We have qualified people in-house to do it, though?
We have a couple,
We
yeah.
have people in-house, okay.
Yes, it's kind of, you gotta balance it and figure it out, because it pulls you away from doing the other things that they do on a daily basis. So, whether, I guess I look at that every day as far as, okay, do we hire this from an outside source, do we do it in-house?
And after this goes through facility committees, I'm sure we'll be more up to speed. I just
Sure.
had those general
Sure.
questions.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Other questions, sir?
What are we doing right now immediately to get our grant schedules up to date? I know one of the things that I dealt with a lot in nonprofits was making sure, especially towards the end of the grant, that we spent the money. And the people in those specific facilities knew, hey, you've got 20 grand to spend, you've got 15 grand to spend, whatever it is. Are we gonna be able to, I guess the first thing we have to do is look at our grant schedule and see what's ending in the next couple of months, and then make sure we're spending that money.
One of the things that I did is, so then internal movement, Ms. Way, she's been assigned to as an interim grants officer internally. So she's actually finished her initial report. I just didn't present it at this board meeting, I'll do it at the next.
All right.
So the point is that we had to put structure behind that. We had grants in too many people's hands. Now we've got things centered in one hand, and we have one person that's looking at that to ensure that we're following those schedules. Also, from a business office standpoint, I've involved Ms. Reinhardt more so in that process with her to ensure that we're reporting back what are the available funds, so people are well aware of what's left to spend. In grants, for me, the issue is spend it, because that's money that comes from the outside, so we have to spend that. The other flip side to that is, if it's not a grant, then we need to really ask some hard questions. Do we really need to spend that money?
Yeah, I just wanna make sure we're spending the money that we have
Yes.
available to us.
In terms of grants, yes.
Is it part of this process as well to develop a list of all the kids that have, the people that somebody was just asking that actually live here but don't go to school here, to try to reach out to maybe get some of those kids back? Or-
We have to, okay, so to answer your question, what you're asking is, how do we change this picture?
Right.
Well, that's a pretty drastic change from one year to the next, or if you look at the last 2 years, if you look at that from 2984 all the way down to 2782. The point is that we need to change that picture, and we need to change that picture by doing something differently in terms of what we have inside.
Right.
There's reasons for that. I'm not gonna go into that,
No,
because
I
that's
know.
not the purpose
I
of
just
this
wanted to know that
discussion.
we can reach out to people and.
Yes, every intention. Our goal is to market, to campaign to those people that have left the school, to say, please come back and take a look. So I've talked to several parents who've taken their kids, they've left, they're in Clinton, or they're someplace else, and I've met them, and they've talked, and they're like, okay, thanks Ryan for all the stuff that you're doing. you know, I'd be willing to take a look at the school again, but you need to give me a better picture of what it's gonna look like. Because if it looks like what it is now, I'm not bringing my kids back. And I said, okay, well, our goal is to try to give you that picture as best as possible in end of April, like we talked about. We'd also like to do something too by inviting those people that have left to come back in, to take a look, to tour what we're doing, to talk to our team, and to see the differences that we're trying to bring apart or bring about in terms of our strategic redesign. Because we can't just tell them that, we have to
No,
show
I
them.
know.
We have to bring them into the school and we have to show them what are the things that are different. How can we guarantee those parents who rip their kids out of Tecumseh to go someplace else that they should come back and they should invest that effort with us? Because realistically speaking, if you got a kid who's in high school and they're a sophomore or they're a junior, they're not gonna
No.
most likely they're not gonna bring their kid back.
No.
Our chances are if they're in 7th and 8th grade and they're about to enter into high school or about to enter into 8th grade, that's our chance to bring those kids back. High school kids, most likely not gonna happen, if we're being direct. Maybe if we get lucky.
I've heard the high school principal's a pretty good guy, so kids.
I've heard he makes my life difficult. Yeah, he's got hair. Question, sir.
Are we gonna know soon with the kindergarten
Roundup?
roundup, what our incoming group is
Yeah.
gonna look like?
Yeah. I mean, that right there is gonna be a tone that's gonna be an initial indicator for us of, are we on the right path? Are we doing the right things? You know, we can't guarantee that. You know, I can't show you causation. You know, I can only show correlation based on those variables, looking at that. That's a very important event for us. That's the reason why we push so hard in doing what we're doing. So, I mean, a small thanks to the team that's been involved in that kindergarten roundup. So they've done a great job of trying to pull that together and to make that a successful event for us. It has to be successful. Because I'm concerned about kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, those early grades, because that's where parents are going to be willing to bring their kids back, to put them back into our system. Or where we're going to get school of choice kids, hopefully. Other questions? Sir?
Just to confirm, you said that back in November, when they approved the school resource officer, they did the budget at the same meeting, but they didn't include any budgetary?
It was not included in the budget completely. There's a 75-25 split with the city. We take 75%, they take 25%, and the point is that wasn't properly planned. You're okay, Chad, don't worry. You're
No,
set.
I mean, this might, I don't know if this matters or not, but I know that, you know, in the early conversations anyways, the money for my position was coming out of a annual renewable grant that occurs pretty much every year.
Mhm. Well,
So it wasn't out of the general fund. Now, that's just what I know,
okay.
which is minimal.
As of right now, that's not the case. But it's all right.
To that point, do we know if there is a grant? That one that maybe we missed last year, or
Is Megan in the room?
We're searching as fast and as hard as we can. Other questions? By the way, a lot of times when people present budgets, they present best case. That's not my style. My style is to plan for the worst and hope for the best. That's what you're seeing right here. Because I'm planning for the worst case scenario. Because I think that's more realistic. So, last but not least, my request to the board is to accept the budget revision 2 that I posted. You have some information in your board packets. You also need to accept the fact that we have to rework a majority of the processes inside of TPS. They have to go hand in hand. We have to be much better at cost controlling than what we're doing right now. And we have to be better at the entire procurement process of how we're looking at things in terms of requisitioner versus approver, as well as ensuring things are even budgeted before we say yes to people to go do something.
Do we have a process in place right now where people have to actually get approval for spending money? Like, you know, if they want to go to a conference, does that have to get approved before they?
Well, it's interesting you should say that because later on in the discussion, we're going to introduce our first travel and expense a policy that needs to be.
So that's a no.
That'd be a no.
Okay.
That'd be a no. And hence the reason why I follow up with the travel and expense policy that I've put in your board packet.
All right, any more questions on the budget? Okay.
All right.
If you want to stay up there and do the travel and expense policy, that would be great.
Sure. I don't know if I have the details in front of me. Hold on a second. Well, you have it in your board packet. If you could open up your board packet, if you wouldn't mind. So it's Tecumseh Public Schools Travel and Expense Reimbursement Administrative Guidelines. So first things, this form is used for travel related to conferences, workshops, student competitions, student conferences, things like that. Essentially, we're requiring people to complete the form. When the conference amount is over $1,500, it has to come to me for pre-approval. So now we're actually interjecting a pre-approval process. Each travel request or each request for travel or conference funds should detail the reasons for the expenditures. So a lot of times I'll see requests for expenditures, but there's not a whole lot of detail behind it, and then I have to hunt down the person that submitted it, and I have to find out what are you doing, where are you going, and why are you doing this. So we've actually requested that now up front. We've now implemented something a little bit more specific in terms of mileage. Meals and tips, that's something too that we've actually come to a limit. So now we're saying daily meals is $65 plus applicable taxes. Alcohol is not a reimbursable expense, period. I mean, we're a public institution. Sorry, teachers. I'm just not picking on the teachers, sorry. Itemized motel, hotel statement or invoices. So essentially too, we had no limits in terms of lodging. Now we're limiting that lodging to $175 a night. However, if there's an event such as New York City or Chicago, I mean, you're not going to find something for probably $175 a night. So there is an exception to that. It just requires approval from my side prior to that. Parking and other fees, we're looking for itemized receipts or proof of payment. And then we're also limiting the tips. So basically tips are up to 20% of the lesser of the meal maximum or actual cost of the meal. So now we put a tip policy in place before. So I mean, these are things that essentially we're just missing that we didn't have. And this is what I'm asking for approval from on your side.
Quick question, the lodging exemptions, that's, it's a broad approval to deviate from that, so if there is an event that's held at a specific venue or hotel?
Correct.
And the price goes?
Yes, correct. So if there's something in Tennessee for, a major conference and they're staying at that hotel, they may not be able to squeeze that into the funds that are allocated for that in terms of what we're setting for limits.
That's part of that broad.
Yeah, exactly. Question, sir?
What's the average cost of these conferences?
Oh, I mean, the stuff that's come across my desk has been everything from $100 to $1,200 to $500. It's really difficult in education to say that there's an average cost.
This $1,500 just seems high to me. I mean, I would think that we wouldn't have a lot of conferences that people are going to.
No, we don't have a lot, but you still have the building principal involved. I mean, so as an example, Mr. Mills still has to go through that request before it comes up to my desk. So he's a filter process already that begins there.
Okay.
And I've already talked to all the principals in terms of what we're doing, in terms of spending money. So he's acting as a filter. So if they make it through him and it comes to me because it's exceeded that amount, then I'm that filter process.
Okay.
But it comes out of his budget.
I just want to make
Right.
sure, like, most of the conferences aren't $1,000 and we're just missing out on.
No. It's not that that's going to escape because, I mean, I'm going to look at the reports. I mean, I'm very cautious in terms of money that's flowing out. Ms. Reinhardt and myself are working on that already, so I see all the cash expenditures going out to TPS. No, that's not going to happen. I mean, I have experience running finance globally, so, I mean, I understand what it takes in order to do cost control. So I've done that for several years. So I understand that, how people work and how they maneuver, how they try to outmaneuver the system if they try to do that. So I'm not worried about that.
Is it your goal to make it a little more detailed, like you said it, schools do it differently than corporations, not in as much detail? But that's by choice. I mean, we could do it as detailed as we wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, my intention is to have the proper documentation. And I mean, ultimately, the goal is the following. Next year rolls around, we start the budgeting process. Mr. Mills talks to his staff and finds out how many conferences are my people going to attend. And let's say he budgets for 10 conferences for his people to go wherever they want to go in the world, okay? Or in the US for whatever conference. At that point in time, he knows he has 10 conferences which are budgeted. And he's going to keep track of that. He's going to be aware of that. So when he gets to conference number 11 and it comes across, is this a budgeted conference? Well, the answer is no at that point in time. So it's going to force him to start making selections and to have more detailed discussions with his own staff during that entire budgeting process. That's the difference between what we did in the past with this top-down approach versus a bottom-up and top-down where they meet. Because building principals, I'm not in their buildings. I mean, I'm not picking on Melanie, but I don't know what she's going to let her teachers go do in terms of conferences or things like that. That's not possible. So she's going to have those discussions with her staff. And when we're in that budgeting process and cycle, and I say, okay, she's budgeting for 50 conferences, I'm going to say, okay, what are we doing and where are we going in terms of conferences? Now, I don't believe that she's going to do that, but that's just an example. That's where that bottom-up process allows me to ask questions when we start that top-down process, so I can verify, okay, what are we doing in terms of conferences? Or textbooks, or different events that they want to host at the school, or different things they put that are high-budget items in terms of their budget that they're trying to get passed. That's the purpose of the top-down and bottom-up approach.
I'll give you an example of something that just hit my desk today. I had 2 teachers do a grant. It's called Teach to Lead. It's in Philadelphia. They won the grant, and it's a pretty difficult grant to get. So 5 of our teachers get to go to Philadelphia. Basically, everything's paid for except their travel there. And so they're going to drive 10 hours. They asked if I would cover gas. I'm going to do that for them. So there's using grants to go and to get better in terms of our practice. So we're pretty excited about that. So you do have things that do pop up, but you have teachers. I've got 5 in my building that are not going to go on their spring break, and that's what their spring break is going to do, is to go get better as a teacher, which is pretty exciting.
Okay, any more questions, discussion?
Why are you looking at me?
All right, Brian, the amendment to the contract with LISD back office support.
Yeah, okay, so let's go to the next one. So that's also in your board packet. I don't know if she's in here. Ms. Reinhardt, Nikki, are you in here? Can you stand for me for just a second? She's an amazing individual. She works really hard, and she's dedicated to us 2 days a week. On paper. The point is, you can have a seat now. So, everyone knows who she is. In a school, that person that's handling the finance, the budgeting, the accountant, basically that person that's on that side of the house, you need to have them available. There's a lot of things that I showed you on a previous presentation that we need to look into, like cost control, like reporting, things like that. So essentially what I've done is I've asked if I could have another day of the week from her, as well as some additional time from her staff that's part-time for us right now. The reason is because this contract with the LISD goes until June 30th, 2019, so it expires at the end of our fiscal year. But from between now and the end of that fiscal year, we need help. And that help essentially is her and another individual allotting more time for us so that we can start crawling through these processes and start fixing the things that need to be fixed in terms of cost control that we have inside of TPS. And that's the reason why I'm asking for it. 2 days a week from an accountant. I mean, she's great. She works super hard while she's here. Most times she doesn't go out and even take lunch, which is actually a bad thing, and I feel horrible about that. But we need more time from her. We really do. And we need more support. And the agreement that we have with the LISD right now, I think it's okay. It works for us. And they have the background and they have the knowledge in terms of school finance, so I just would like to be able to use their resources more. Essentially what that entails is looking at it, we're talking about an increase of another day for her. Someone, what they call a business services clerk as well, is moving them, they're part-time, and that's going to 40 hours. And we're looking at, right now, we spend $246,000 right now for the LISD, and that includes payroll and several other services that they provide in the business financial services side for us. And essentially what we're raising that to Let me find that number, is $266,104. So that's an increase from $246,000 to $266,000. And that basically carries us through the rest of the year. And I factored that also too into the budget as well, so budget revision 2, that was factored. Openly speaking, I can't make the type of changes that need to be made without having your help, and without having your team's help. It's just not possible. There's not enough hours. So that's the background. Do you have any questions in terms of that support contract?
They have the capacity, obviously.
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
So I talked to Mr. Haig, he's the superintendent at the LISD. I mean, I went through this process of discussing with him prior, and they're okay behind it. So the process would be is that if we approve that, or if you approve that as a board, then they have to pass that. What day is that? March 4th. They'll take that into their board meeting, and once they approve that, then we're ready to go basically the day after. I know normally we like to discuss things and then vote on it in the next board meeting. This is one of those times where both the budget as well as this, I'm asking that we accelerate that process because there's things that we need to do in terms of the financial side.
The one's under action items, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't see the budget. Right, I don't see budget.
We can wait till the next meeting if you want to do the budget, so you have time to think about it if you want to ask some questions. That's fine, but at least on the LISD side, I really need to execute that. I need help.
How many people do we have on payroll currently?
So full-time, one FTE per payroll person, .9 FTE, she does accounts receivable and a whole slew of other small things. We have the business office clerk, she's currently 25 hours a week. That's the position he's referring to, 40 hours. 2 days a week for me.
That's it.
How many people do we pay? I guess I should rephrase that. How many,
District-wide?
how many teachers, administrators, custodians, how many paychecks?
How many people are on
How many
payroll?
Oh, the
paychecks do we
payroll,
cut?
the total payroll.
Yeah, I want to know what, because this is one of the services that they're providing, right?
Yes, they provide payroll for the entire district.
Yes, so do we have a estimate on how many people we
I
pay?
think 350, 400.
I think it's 400. It's
400 bi-weekly?
Yeah.
Yes.
And we have 40 people on each staff, she does have to.
Okay, thank you.
So all the timesheets and calculations based on that. So we still have pretty much a paper-based timesheet process.
Paper?
You asked, I told you we have a paper-based timesheet process. Is it antiquated? Yes. Does it need to change? Yes, we know that, but
Quit putting it on
I need help.
Chromebook?
Sorry.
Okay, any other questions or discussion?
We also have a paper-based expense reporting platform too, in case you wanted to know that.
I didn't.
All right, let's move on to action item. Thank you, Ryan.
Yes, sir.
All right, the first action item is the field trip to 2020 for the trip to Greece that we heard on the last board meeting. And I get a motion to approve that trip.
So moved. Support.
Roll call. Benson.
Aye.
Brooks. Aye. Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara.
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, then we've got a donation for a color television valued at $300 from Ashley Landy that we need to accept. Can you give us a little background on that, Griff?
Somebody just had a color TV that was in really good shape. It's a flat screen and asked if the district could use it. We took it and I'm sure we'll find a,
Okay.
Find a home for it?
yeah.
Nice, awesome, thank you. Can we get approval for accepting the donation from Ashley Lundy?
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing.
Aye.
Brooks. Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara.
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, and want to give us a little background on that donation from Peter? Anybody? Anything about that?
going towards the sculpture garden. We're in phase 2 of that, and it's a personal donation that somebody's made towards it.
So
It's
we have
in
to bring,
memory of
we have to
somebody.
bring we have to bring the donations for the sculpture garden through the Board of Education. So that's the reason why. You're gonna actually see that as we move forward, you're gonna see several of those popping up in terms of the agenda, just as an FYI. This won't be the last one you'll see.
Can I get a motion to approve the, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I read the letter, and it's, the donation's actually in honor of Christine Obide, so I just wanted to make sure we recognize that.
Thank you.
All right, can I get a motion to approve the donation around $15 for the sculpture garden at the high school? Oh, 1,500, sorry.
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing?
Aye.
Brooks?
Aye.
Johnson?
Aye.
McNamara?
Aye.
Moore?
Aye.
Simpson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, and if you're unaware, the minimum wage increased in the state of Michigan, so we need to increase that. I don't know if you have employees or not.
We have just a handful of employees.
Okay, so we need to increase that.
March 29th from 9:25 to 9:45 an hour.
So,
Say that again?
From 9:25 to 9:45 an hour, and that it has to be implemented on March 29th.
so we need to vote to,
So moved.
Support. Roll call. Benzing?
Aye.
Brooks?
Aye.
Johnson?
Aye.
McNamara?
Aye.
Moore?
Aye.
Simpson?
aye.
Motion carries.
We can add that to the next board meeting, it's fine.
Yeah, I think we need to.
Take some time to think about it.
I think we need to.
Yes.
That, so, good. All right, we also need a motion to accept the amendment to the contract with LISD back office support. Is there any discussion on that, or first, before we, no discussion?
We have to do it.
Yeah. Can I get a motion to approve?
I move that we accept the amendment to the contract with the LISD back office support.
Second.
Roll call. Benzing?
Aye.
Brooks?
Aye.
Johnson?
Aye.
McNamara?
Aye.
Moore?
Aye.
Simpson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, then can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes from February 11th?
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing?
Aye.
Brooks?
Aye.
Johnson?
Aye.
McNamara?
Aye.
Moore?
Aye.
Simpson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Then items scheduled for the next agenda, good news is Sundog National Math Competition. Discussions, reports, special education update. Action items would be school of choice and school budget update. And this will bring us to our final public comment portion of the meeting. So if you have any comments, please direct them to the board, and you're limited to 2 minutes because agendas are full.
Hi, I'm Shelley Moore. I'm a 25-year resident of Tecumseh. I have 2 girls who graduated from here, and I currently have a student at Compass in 6th grade. And unfortunately, Mr. Rhodes, these are kind of directed at you because they come from the One Tecumseh vision we talked about earlier. I'll start out by saying something positive. I really appreciate the fact that you're doing a bottoms-up budget. I know my work as both a teacher and a principal. The more teachers and principals are involved in the process, the more they kind of understand where the money's going. And it makes for less, well, you can't do it because I don't like you kind of stuff. If you budgeted X amount of money for something, then everybody understands it's not a big deal. So I appreciate that. That's not typical always in school, so I appreciate that. At the very beginning of your One Tecumseh, you talked about synthesizing the mission of the board based on what they were elected for. Is that something we would plan to share with the community?
Yes.
Okay, good. Do you have any timeline for that?
I just finished the last interview this morning. So,
Okay.
I mean, I know this is public comment, but I'd like to address it if it's okay with the board. I mean, I just finished the last interview this morning, and I have to compile all the all the results, and then I'm hoping by early next week I'll publish that. I've mentioned that before, we want to push everything out to our TPS website under the one Tecumseh, because I want people to see what we're doing.
Just so that I'm in order, do you just want me not to ask questions, just to comment on it? Would you prefer I not ask questions? That's fine. That's fine.
Technically, you're supposed to direct comments to the board. That's
Oh,
what we're.
okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm curious about the observation that you're going to be doing at other schools. I'm wondering if you have chosen the schools. Are any of the schools you're choosing to observe currently implementing PBL or standards-based grading?
Keep going.
Keep going.
I don't know, you want us to answer that?
No.
I'm confused. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
When you talked earlier, data was presented, and one of the things that Mr. Rhodes talked about was the best practices and how data have been collected about best practices in the district. And I'm curious what best practices were looked at and what the data was collected from that. Okay. And I'm not saying this to be a smart aleck, but I'm wondering if the board has thought anymore about a timeline for posting and hiring a fully credentialed superintendent. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tom Pinard. I have a kindergarten student at North Early Learning Center. There was a story I read in the newspaper not long ago about a high school kid that punched another kid. And in the process of looking at this situation, they determined that that child must be expelled because he was a danger to not only that child, but other children in the classroom, as well as teachers and staff. And I thought to myself, well, of course, isn't that the reasonable thing to do? Then I thought about my child in kindergarten, who is in a classroom with another child that has been gouging students, been punching students, been choking students, been urinating on students, been using the F word freely and nearly almost every day. And I have kind of talked to everybody, and they tell me that certain processes have gone on. I was lied to. Things didn't go on. This hasn't been handled. So I thought, you know, this is the last place I want to be. I don't want to be up here talking about this stuff. But it shouldn't be happening. My child should be able to go to a school and have a safe learning environment. So today I pulled up the schools, the buildings policies. And I read a lot about bullying, and there's some things on there that kind of relate. But I was looking at the discipline policy in the code of conduct. And it says the goal is to provide a safe and orderly learning environment. Staff members work hard to establish and maintain positive discipline. We have two basic guidelines. Two basic guidelines. First one is disruption of the educational process is unacceptable. The second is that learners may not endanger themselves or others. Now, this child in this classroom has been doing this for a long time. It's been swept under the rug. I'm over it. I want something done. I've asked for it to be done, and it hasn't. I've sent emails. We're in the process of working together on this thing. But my child is afraid. My child comes home every day, says, Dad, do you know what so-and-so did today? It's not, do you know what we painted in class today? Do you know what we sang? No, it's, do you know what so-and-so did today? These are assaults. They're happening in kindergarten, and because of maybe this child's circumstances, they're being ignored. I don't know why, but it's time to stop this. I implore you to make this stop, and make it stop now. Thank you.
So I just wanted to point out, survey, it sounds like we're not gonna be surveying students. It became clear from the one Tecumseh kind of petered off when we got to students, whether we'd be surveying them on what their experiences are. As far as, I'm really glad we're gonna have somebody from the LISD budget taking more time with the domain expertise in the budgeting process. I understand you have corporate experience, but I don't think that that's necessarily applicable to public schools. As we're talking about.
Stop.
You need to direct your comments to the board, you're not gonna direct them to any employees.
It's who I'm looking at then?
No, just be general,
Just be
Just be general, he's a member of the board, okay.
Don't mention any names.
Don't mention any names. No names.
Well, none boss. You're supposed to be talking to everyone.
Okay.
Not a specific person.
Okay. So as far as the nice graph that we had up there, that was put up there by Mr. Rhodes, the 2008 onward demographic shift is perfectly understandable. There was a global economic collapse, and there was a bunch of changes in the demographics in the community, and people went elsewhere. We can also take a look at what that impact was in that graph for that last year. And I think, it's interesting to me to hear you folks talking about how concerned you are about how many people left the district when you participated in driving out people from the district. That includes, of course, the local media, who was more than happy to participate in an 18-month-long campaign of besmirching Tecumseh Public Schools every week in the paper. In addition, we're going to start talking about the budget here. I think it's interesting that there wasn't any discussion about the $68,000 that was allocated at the first board meeting here the last board meeting in January for something that turns out, when I did some research on it, if you're a good faith effort to implement the E-rate software, you're not at any jeopardy for the district. And in fact, the only penalty really, as far as I was able to figure out, is they take some money away from you, not giving you your grant next year. So if we're concerned about those kinds of things, budgetary concerns, I also noticed that there isn't any discussion about how much it's costing for the 3 different superintendent bills that we're paying. I know that we've got 2 co-superintendents, and then we've got one that we're still paying that's on budget. And then we have down at the South Learning Center, of course, we've got, we're paying for 2 principals. So, also, I'm just a little concerned about the ability of our superintendent to know what he's talking about. And specifically what I'm talking about is the not having spent any money on the bells or the PA maintenance that was done before. And specifically, the issue I think that's been refuted by the people that were in the position to provide that maintenance. I'm a little concerned about the number of times I've heard representations made by our superintendent that turn out not to be 100% accurate. That's a deep concern to me, especially when we start talking about budgetary concerns and behaving as if those budgetary concerns weren't something that we had some knowledge of in advance.
Thank you, Bill. Your 3 minutes are up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Good evening, board. I'd like to thank all you guys for taking the job on, because obviously none of you needed this, including you two. You guys are doing a hell of a job. I love the fact that the board's all on board together as a board. You guys don't fight and bicker. You work things out and you agree upon them, and that's it. We have some individuals that just consistently show up just to cause problems. We all know this. We all know who they are. And it just continues week after week. But the bottom line is you guys are doing a hell of a job. And for the rest of us out there, the 61% that voted for you, we thank you.
All right, let's move on to the superintendent update.
Really, the only thing I have is just a little bit more information on, Chad's done a lot of work on the school safety grant. We can achieve up to $250,000. To do that, he's done a lot of work, like I said, in the short term, and we would like to have a quick meeting Thursday night to approve the remaining pieces for us to qualify for that grant for you guys. So just some structural things that we need to do.
This Thursday?
Yeah.
What time?
Whatever would be good for you guys, 6 or 7 o'clock, something along. whatever's good for you. It should not be a long thing. We'll have some information to share with you the closer we get. But we're just trying to qualify for that grant. Chad, you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, if we would have had a little bit more time, I would have probably had it on the agenda. So it's not only the application, putting the finances together, but part of the grant requires that the board have a policy, emergency operations policy. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I really couldn't find a comprehensive emergency operations policy. The grant specifies a number of different, almost 26 different criteria that have to be in place within this EOP to qualify for the grant. Deadline is noon on Friday, okay? The figures have been put together. The equipment, the vendors and all that kind of, it's looking like just video cameras for the district buildings. The big part is gonna try to be get this EOP put into place, which requires, some MOUs with different organizations. For instance, as far as the active shooter policy, you're supposed to have MOUs.
What's that MOU?
Memorandums of understanding. It's essentially a contract.
Oh, okay.
For places that are determined to be the unification points, if in
It's like
fact.
a fire drill for.
Something like that,
Kind
but
of.
the unification points would be off campus. So you have to have some sort of agreement with that location, so that essentially it's just an agreement that lets us use that building in the case of emergency where they would be utilized as a reunification point, meaning they'll provide access and so forth. Different responsibilities, the school's supposed to have a emergency response team. So it's those kind of things that we'll have to try to get together for the next, couple days. So if it's okay with the board, I'd like to pursue, on behalf of the board, because I'm not a TPS employee, to pursue not only this plan, but to reach out and try to at least get the conversation on these MOUs.
Absolutely.
If you need any help or support from those things.
Oh, sure, I'll need a lot of help. Thank you.
Is this the grant that Clinton recently got?
Believe so.
To update their security also, same?
Yep, it's a state grant for fiscal year 1920. It's due on Friday at noon.
All right.
Fortunately, by email.
Well, can we get a motion then to have a meeting Thursday night at 7 o'clock and if for some reason we're gonna get it pulled together, then we won't have.
We'll get it together.
All right, we'll get it together, so.
Okay, I make a motion that we have a meeting on Thursday.
What's the 28th?
Yep.
Yeah.
Here in the boardroom?
Yes, here in the board.
Can we make it 6:45? Sorry. I got a 7:30 appointment.
Can we do it at 9? There's a
You do
band.
it at 6:30.
Just wanna
Make
throw
it
that out.
6:30.
I'm trying to fit it in.
Can we just make it at 6:30?
Yeah, let's make it a 6.
Yeah, 6:30.
Sure, we'll make that work.
We can't be here at 6:30?
It'll be close.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay.
We better leave it at 6:45?
You're making that window smaller. so
I
it's
know,
a lot
I'm trying to
of
be
pressure on Chad.
nice, but
Okay.
he's tied up on both ends,
I'm
before and
tied up on
after.
both ends. I've got a gap.
All right, well,
6:30 on Thursday.
6:45.
6:45.
6:45 it is.
John's
I
the boss
get
of
a
this.
motion for 6:45 on the 28th here in the
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing.
Aye.
Brooks. Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara.
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
And Ryan, did you have anything in the superintendent's report or?
Yes, we have two things. One, the Director of Student Services will begin the interview process this week. For that, we actually have several candidates, both internal and external, and we'll begin that process.
4 total?
How many total do we have, Joanna? 6? Yes, we have 6, but we filtered out some of those people to come down to 6. So we actually had more than 6. We just came down to what we considered were the 6 best candidates, and then we'll go from there. The other thing is, internally, just to let you know that we're working on a process to basically re-engineer the way that we handle the FOIA request inside. So we have several FOIA requests at the moment. The point is that that process right now is pretty unstructured. Things flow in via email to Griff, myself, maybe both of us, maybe some other party, which has actually happened. And we need to find a structured process in terms of how we handle FOIA requests. So we'll be meeting this week to work on bringing something to the board within the next, hopefully by the next official board meeting, in terms of implementing a better process for that. Because right now it's chaotic and can cause an issue in terms of being able to respond properly, as an example. So there's best practice for us to learn from other schools. So we're just going to look at how other people deal with it and we'll copy what they do and implement that process.
Can we just do something simple like create an email that's like FOIA at TPS K-12?
I mean, that's one of the things we're looking at. We're also looking at like a Google Form submission so that you can submit a FOIA request directly on our website so that that gets routed to the right people, so the right departments, and we know that. I'm the only one who can answer a FOIA request because I'm the legal representative for the district. So it doesn't do any good for that FOIA request to go anyplace else except for it to come across my desk because ultimately I'm the one that has to release that.
Tim, do we need to make a motion so he can actually give him permission to move forward with all the,
Because I'm gonna be asking businesses, or generally nonprofits, to facilitate a contract between the school and themselves.
Let's do one.
Just to-
yeah, let's get it,
That's covered.
And again, I apologize,
Yes.
it's not on the agenda, I just.
That's
didn't have
fine.
time.
Yes, it's actually something you need
it's
to
a quick thing.
What's the grant called?
So it's school safety grant,
Okay.
put it on through the Michigan State Police.
All right, can I get a motion for Officer Rogers to pursue the school safety grant on behalf of Tecumseh Public Schools?
So move.
Roll call. Benzing.
Aye.
Brooks. Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara.
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right.
You guys, one last thing for me, and I just kind of feel led to say this from an update standpoint. I know there's some tough things that we have to get through as a district. Boy, I'd rather get through these things with the teachers, with the administrators, with the kids that we have. Don't lose sight. I mean, there are things we need to get better at. I don't disagree with anybody that has talked tonight, but we have the foundation of the right things to make this go the direction that we want it to go. And I just think it's important that we all realize that. It's okay for people to have difference of opinion. That's okay. But we all still live in this community. When it's all said and done, we always come together. And I've said this before, and I hope you know I'm kind of the eternal optimist, but this is a really good place. I've lived here for 14 years. My kids went through here. It's a really good place. And it's a place that I'm proud of. And I know you guys have that here, even though there might be some differences of opinion. Don't forget about the good things that we have as well. Thank you.
When people get up and they actually have questions, is somebody taking notes to maybe get back with, make sure that all the questions that anybody has brought up are answered?
Yeah, and the other thing that Ryan and I are willing to do, just because of the format of the board meeting, it's not a question and answer thing, but if you have a question, we'll stick around here and we'll do our best to answer whatever we can.
That's a good idea.
And if we don't have the information, we'll find it and get it to you guys. I don't want anybody to think that we're being disrespectful. That's not what we are. We're following what board meetings are supposed to look like and how they're set up. So we're more than willing to do that, just so you guys know. We'll do our best.
All right, can I get a motion to move to closed session?
Board member comment discussion?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Board member comment discussion? Any comments, discussion?
Everybody summed it up.
I'll throw out there, there was some paperwork, documents that were missing from the board office and some that were corrupted. And it's caused a delay, a very slight one, in getting things posted like our meeting minutes. Those documents had to be verified for accuracy and some of them had to be recreated. I think we're at the end of this now, I believe. Anna's taking that on as her 4th or 5th job here now, so, oh, Griff, do we have?
No,
Fifth,
I wasn't
okay.
volunteering.
So I think we have all the documents recovered that were missing or corrupted at this point. So starting from this point moving forward, we should be a little bit more on schedule getting the minutes posted and such.
And then we can pick up our board packets early.
Working towards that.
Yeah. The day before.
All right, can I get a motion to adjourn to closed session?
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing.
Aye.
Brooks. Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara. Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries 3-5.
We'll go to the green room.
See, I didn't make it.
All right, it is 9:08, we're returning from closed session. Can I get a motion to accept the resignation of a teacher?
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing.
Aye.
Brooks.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara.
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, and can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting, please?
So moved.
Support.
Roll call. Benzing.
Aye.
Brooks.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
McNamara.
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
Simpson.
Aye.
Motion carries.